Looking forward to our thing in a few weeks.
Yeah, I don't know if I'll end up being there, but I'm hoping to. It's been.
What do you guys have like a liberal cuddle party, or what are you doing?
Yeah. Larry takes a bunch of MDMA, and we all sort of go into the corner and hang out together.
God, that sounds incredible.
Liberalism is wonderful, man. You should come try it.
That's not liberalism. It's called something else. Ezra. Sorry, Nikki, is our CryptoCzar joining us or no?
He's, I'm talking to now. It looks like he is.
Oh, zing. This is going to be great.
This would be like ratings bonanza. All right, we do have David Sachs here. David, make sure you have your quick time on.
Look at Saxy Poo, looking so presidential.
He looks thin, doesn't he?
Oh, he looks fabulous.
All right, here we go. 3, 2.
Let your winners ride.
Rain Man David Sachs.
And instead, we open source it to the fans, and they've just gone crazy with it.
Love you, West Queen of Quinoa.
Hello， 大家好，我是立恩。今天带大家来看的是美国非常火红的 podcast 节目，叫 All In。那 All In 特别是在矽谷科技圈来讲，可以说是第一名最红的节目。All In 啊，是由4个顶级的矽谷风投家，也就是风险投资者所共同组成创办的一档节目，分别是 Summers、Ali Hapitia 跟 Jason Calacanis。还有 David Sachs 跟 David Freiberg， 那这4个其实都非常的有名啊，各个身价都是亿万等级的富豪美元哦。好，那他们4个人哦，说来也妙，他们其实是蛮要好的牌友。在这个2020年，也就是 COVID-19 期间呢，我不知道是不是因为重创了他们自己的这个本业还是怎么样哈，或者是闲的没事干哈，他们就突发奇想，想说我们一起来搞一个 podcast 节目好了，就我们4个来聊嘛，不时可以邀请一些名人。那没有想到开始上线之后呢，就非常受到商业、金融圈跟科技圈的欢迎哈。事实上，他们的节目不光吸引精英分子，节目的火爆程度可以说在全球的影响力都越来越大。如果严格要讲说输给这个 Joe Rogan 的话呢，可是排名也有前3的等级，特别是在商业跟科技这个领域专业度，我个人认为目前无人能出其右。看他们的节目，可以在短时间之内学到远胜过你在很多外面能够听到的东西。好，那我今天就是要来带大家看他们在4月12号一期非常有名也非常火爆的一档节目，就是他们特别请到了前民主党总统克林顿时期的美国财政部长 Larry Summers 呢，来谈川普的关税学。另外多邀请到的一位是 Ezra， 他是一个自由派的独立评论员，长期是支持民主党，也可以说是相当的左派人士了啦。等于是2个左派民主党的人，其中一个美国前财政部长 Summers 这样重量级呢，没想到呢，讨论着就擦出了很大的火花哈。因为除了 Jason 的角色是纯主持，带流程，那另外David Sachs 跟 Summers 呢，他们2个都是非常支持川普这一次打关税贸易战的，所以没有想到啊，就很微妙的发展成了一个2打2的局面，也就是左派跟右派的大对决了。如果大家能够把它听完的话呢，你会发现美国左右派对于这次关税看法巨大的分歧点在哪里，以及美国到底左右派是如何看待中国问题。那我呢会陪大家来收看，在这中间做一些讲评，好让大家更容易进入去享受这一个非常丰富非常棒的关税大辩论节目当中。 OK， 那话不多说，就让我们一起来看吧。 Let's go。
All right, everybody, welcome back to the #1 podcast in the world. I'm your host, Jason Calacanis, with my besties, Chamath Palihapitiya, our chairman dictator, and live from, well, the administration, Mr. David Sachs, our czar for AI and crypto. And amazingly, 2 fantastic guests this week. We have New York Times writer and host of the Ezra Klein podcast. He's got a new book with Derek Thompson, Abundance, and he co-founded Vox in 2014, and he's our guest here today before Trump ships him to El Salvador. Please welcome Ezra Klein. How are you, sir?
Glad to be here in my final hours of freedom.
Okay, great. Good to be here. Sorry, Sachs. And with us, of course, Larry Summers, economist, former Treasury Secretary under Clinton, former director of the National Economic Council under Obama, and the president of Harvard from 2001 to 2006. Thanks for coming, Larry.
Good to be with you.
Okay, we have a lot to get to here, so we might as well talk about the big news of tariffs. It's day 80 of the Trump presidency, a second presidency, his second term, and Trump tweeted that he paused tariffs for everyone but China on Wednesday. Basically, let me just cue up the details, Larry, and then we'll get your take on all of this. Just 1 week after Liberation Day, Trump announced on Truth Social that, in effect, he was raising tariffs against China 125% based on their lack of respect, quote unquote, instead of negotiating, and that he was pausing reciprocal tariffs on all other countries for 90 days. And markets ripped 10% after he posted this. And today, Thursday, when we tape, there's been a massive sell-off on Wall Street, so the roller coaster ride continues. What it will be on Friday when you consume this podcast is anyone's guess. S&P is down 5% today. For context, the S&P was at 5,700 pre-Liberation Day, so about a 9% drop after these wild swings. And in fact, this has been historic volatility. Here are the top sell-offs in history. As you can see, 3 of them came during Black Monday in 1987. 3 of them came during the financial crisis. 3 of them came during COVID. And coming in 11th is Trump's tariffs. Also, in the gainers, you have these big rebounds. Wednesday's 9.5% recovery was number 3. The administration says this was all part of a master plan. We'll hear more about that later. And that they laid a trap for China. They laid a trap. Bessent has been the spokesperson during this retreat, or whatever we're going to call the pause. And, quote, "This was driven by the president's strategy. He and I had a long talk on Sunday, and this was his strategy all along." I don't think we need to play the clip. That's the gist of it. The White House account then tweeted in all caps, my favorite way to tweet, "Do not retaliate and you will be rewarded." Wall Street Journal, on the other side, posted a story about why Trump blinked. They chronicled the decision as being affected by Jamie Dimon, who went on Fox to express fears of recession while saying the tariffs were valid and that he knew the Trump and cabinet would be watching him on Fox. Other banking executives who felt they didn't have a lot of influence in this administration, according to the Wall Street Journal, started lobbying Republican lawmakers that the Trump tariff plan would tank the economy. The White House Chief of Staff, Susie Wiles, started receiving calls from executives and lobbyists expressing concerns. And the Wall Street Journal reports that Trump was influenced heavily by Bessent. They were flooded with worried calls from Wall Street and that the president was lobbied to find an off-ramp. Trump ultimately relied on his instincts, according to the administration. Larry, is this 4D chess or is this something else? What are your thoughts?
This is dangerous work with a sledgehammer on a pretty sensitive machine, which is the global economy, that's having really serious consequences. First, it's important to understand that there's more tariffs that are around than you described. Even after the big back off, there's a 10% across the board tariff, a range of structural tariffs like on steel and automobiles, and a range of new tariff threats like on pharmaceuticals. Here's a kind of market-based estimate of what the damage that the market thinks this is all doing to the U.S. economy is. Market's down. Let's take today's number, 9%. If that's right, that would be about $4 trillion. Of course, the $4 trillion since Liberation Day. Of course, markets were down coming into Liberation Day because of some anticipation of these policies. So let's be conservative and say these policies have taken $6 trillion off the stock market. Now, the stock market only measures the adverse impact on corporate profits, not the adverse impact on workers, not the adverse impact on consumers. So you need to add to that stock market number. One way of thinking about adding to it would be to say that corporate profits were 10% of the economy. So you could argue for multiplying by a factor of 10, but maybe that's being too exaggerating or too bold. So let's multiply by a factor of 5. And what you get is a loss in the $30 trillion range. as the present value as estimated by markets of what's being done. Now, I know the Trump administration sometimes likes to say it's working for Main Street, not Wall Street. I noticed that they were pretty excited about the stock market rally yesterday in a way that wouldn't really go with not caring about markets. So I think what markets are seeing what's true, which is three things. This is an inflation shock because you're adding to prices. CEO of Amazon got it right. The Secretary of the Treasury got it wrong. Increases in tariffs of this magnitude, the overwhelming part of them will be passed on to consumers. So you've got an inflation shock. When you raise the prices of people and their income, at least in the short run, is the same, they're poorer, and that means they can afford less stuff, and that pushes the economy down. And so you've got higher inflation, and you've got less demand, and therefore more unemployment. And all of that's bad for the economy and companies. And the last thing, which I think is profoundly important, is we are trading like an emerging market country right now. For serious countries, for the United States, the pattern is that when the world gets riskier, the bonds go down in yield and the currency goes up in value because people come for the safe haven. When you're a country like Argentina, then the assets all move together. Falling stock prices go with higher bond yields, go with a weakening currency. And so because of our erratic behavior, we have changed the zeitgeist surrounding America from the traditional zeitgeist surrounding America to the kind of zeitgeist that surrounded Juan Perón's Argentina. And that goes with all the other things that are happening. The more protectionism, denying the independence of the central bank, fiscal irresponsibility, breakdown of traditional boundaries between government and business, substantial cronyism as a strategy, authoritarian tendencies towards the opposition, lack of total respect for the judiciary.
Keep going, Larry. Keep going.
What we're seeing is a pattern of America being governed on the kind of Juan Perón Argentina model. And that sometimes produces some benefits for some people in the short run. That sometimes generates popularity for it. Perón kept coming back in Argentina, but ultimately it's extremely costly for a society.
You've heard Larry's take on all of this.
Larry's giving it about a B+ on the Harvard grade scale.
Which might be inflated, I'm not sure. Sachs, obviously, in the administration, you cover two things, AI and, of course, crypto. And you're a member of the pod, so let's get your take on what happened this week with these tariffs. Even the most ardent supporters of Trump have felt this is chaotic, not well executed, not communicated well. What is your take, Sachs, on how this was executed, and could this have been done better?
Well, I think what happened, if you go back to Liberation Day was only 8 days ago, it was April 2nd. If I had told you on April 1st that Donald Trump would find a way to get the entire world to eagerly embrace a 10% tariff on the American market, and not only would they not complain, but they'd actually be relieved that it was only 10%, you would have said that would be an April Fool's joke. If I had told you 8 days ago or 9 days ago that Trump would find a way to accelerate the United States' decoupling from China, which is something he's long wanted to do, and that Wall Street would basically breathe a sigh of relief over that, you would have said that there's no way that could happen. If I had told you 8 or 9 days ago that President Trump figured out a way to assert a presidential power in a way that gives America extraordinary leverage over virtually every country in the world, you would have said, well, I don't believe it. I don't, what is that power? And he proceeded to do that. And now basically every country in the world, except for China, is coming to Washington seeking to negotiate a new trade deal for the United States on better terms for the U.S.
If you told me any of that a few days ago, I would have believed you, and I would have thought the consequences would be a substantially deteriorated American economy and a substantially less secure
I don't think we know
United
that.
States.
I don't think we know that.
It's not any surprise. There's nothing surprising about the fact that the United States has the power to extort Lesotho. It's just, and that's the country that was singled out in the Trump formula for the highest level of protection. There is no surprise in that. There is no surprise that
That's
the
not who's
United
coming
States
to Washington
has the
right
capacity
now.
to isolate itself
That's not
from
who's
China.
coming to Washington right
It will
now,
be
Larry.
very, very costly.
Japan's coming to Washington. South Korea is coming to Washington.
Everybody's going to try to cut a
Everyone's
deal.
going to come to
but that
Washington.
doesn't-
Never would have occurred to anyone with experience in government that the United States would have any difficulty getting any major country to come send a representative to the United States to have a discussion and a negotiation with the United States on a matter that was of concern to the United
Then,
States.
Larry, why
Never
didn't they?
could possibly have come as any
Okay,
surprise.
let me let Sachs reply to that, and then Ezra, I'm going to bring you in. Sachs, go ahead, you reply.
Then why didn't they, Larry? Do you think that all these countries were going to renegotiate their trade deals with the U.S. if President Trump asked nicely, if he said, pretty please, let's renegotiate our trade deals so you take down your trade barriers, they would have done it? If he had said, pretty please with a cherry on top, that's not the way these things work. He had to establish the leverage in the negotiation first. And the fact of the matter is he's the first president in decades who's been willing to do that. You don't get anywhere by just asking nicely. And I think that what President Trump did over the last 8 days is A, establish the leverage, and B, get all these countries to now want to negotiate a new trade deal with the United States.
好，前面一开始啊，毕竟来者是客啊，所以主持群呢先让重量级的美国前财政部长 Larry 呢先来发表。那 Larry 呢大名大放的讲了一大堆 ，Summers 中间啊听他讲太久了，就说继续哈，其实已经有一点不以为然了啊。那基本上 Larry 他的担忧有他的道理，这个是目前典型的一个反对川普的说法。但是呢，几个重点严格拆开来看不正确好比说他讲到美国的经济会因为这个关税战而会大幅的经济下滑甚至进入萧条，那通货膨胀会加剧。事实上，如果是经济大萧条衰退的话，是通货紧缩，不可能是通货膨胀这个也是现在大家很多错误的迷思。你进口的东西变少了嘛？那会不会商人可能趁机这个时候反而抬价或者是说我因为保护美国本土制造业的商品，而因此制造业就失去了竞争力，而纷纷抬高价格，或者说你关税进来而抬高价格，造成物价上涨是合理的推论，没有错。但是这个呢，并不符合通货膨胀的逻辑。那这个以后有机会我们再来讲，通货膨胀本质是什么？通货膨胀本质并不是物价往上定高了就叫通货膨胀，大家要了解。现在是缺乏商品性而可能导致物价抬高，不是因为通货膨胀。那就算你说通货膨胀好了，可是你怎么又说经济衰退呢？这个仍然是说不通的。经济衰退的时候，反而是大家不愿消费，以至于经济无法流通。通货膨胀永远都是货币流通的速度超过于商品生产的速度。现在很多人喜欢把通货膨胀跟经济衰退两件事放在一起讲，这本质上是矛盾，说不通那回过来讲，现在没有人能够像川普这么成功的让全世界各国领袖呢，大部分都愿意赶紧的来跟华府这边重启贸易协定，重启谈判Larry 的讲法一副好像说，哎呀，美国要做这件事情，以美国这个大国来讲的话，要谁来重启谈判还不容易嘛？这个错了。事实上，美国过去就是因为做不到这一点。如果真的做得到的话，那你怎么不早点去做，对不对？因为你就是没有办法在保持全球化贸易的情况之下，还能够来做贸易谈判的。因为全球化贸易这个游戏规则它早已建构了，所以现在其实川普政府要做的是一个 reset 就是重置，就是我呢不依照过去的方式来运行，我要重新的来开启一个新的贸易方式，包含了川普认为过去长期的不对等的贸易关税。那我们先不论他这样的到底是合理还是不合理，我们先不论合理性，可是至少他确实是利用提高关税的贸易战的方式达到重启的目的性，机会比较大，这没有什么好说的。 你不可能在那边拜托人家求人家的，你就可以来跟人家定重启，这谁理你？好，这是很简单的逻辑。Abby Sachs 他对 Larry 表达不以为然，你嘴巴说得很轻松，可事实上就是没有人能够做到川普这次愿意付诸实行在做的。但是呢，我比较认同 Larry 的一个地方是在于，关税战对目前全球化贸易的经济角度来讲的话，是全球都有伤害，这点确实是不会错的。美国自己本身会不会受伤？我认为也会受伤。可是呢，美国不受这个伤的话，难道美国体质就是健康的吗？这个有点像是什么？我认为美国现在的状况其实就有点像是癌症的化疗。好，简单讲就是你做了化疗呢，可能你的好细胞也会加速死亡，但是你不做化疗的话，你就注定死。好，我认为现在美国就比较类似像这种情况。
If this is such a terrific thing, why do markets think it's so terrible for the American economy? Maybe the market's just completely wrong, but at least another possibility is
the question
that
is,
the market's judging this. That the job of markets is to look forward. It's to look past the immediate. It's to see what the long-run consequences are going to be. And markets are making a pretty devastatingly negative judgment.
Not true. Not true. Larry, that's not
step.
true. That feels emotional and nice, but it's just not accurate. So let's just establish a couple facts about quote-unquote the markets. Number one, there are two markets, and they behave totally differently and sometimes inversely to each other. There's the stock market, and there's the bond market. With respect to the stock market, what they are debating, and you're right, Larry, is what is the effective long-term rate of return a dollar needs to generate in order to pay me back that dollar. That is what the fundamental stock market does. And what we have seen for many years with trade imbalances, trade deficits, and close to zero interest rates, of which more of that happened under Democrats and Republicans, we have allowed the stock market to inflate past historical averages. What we've actually seen happen in the last week is what most people would call mean reversion. The stock market is still way above where it was last year, 2 years ago, 3 years ago. What has happened is that the forward multiples have compressed. So that's number one. That's a fact. You can debate whether that's bad or good, and I'm willing to debate that with you.
Okay, now let's go to bonds. Yeah.
And then with respect to bonds, what we are seeing now is there are two very complicated issues. And we don't know what the unknown known is. And let me be very specific. In the last 2 days, we saw one part of the bond market totally get out of whack. And what we know is that the yields changed materially in a very acute way, which is atypical of how the bond market typically digests a philosophical change in approach to policy. Normally, when you see an acute reaction in the bond market, the underlying reason tends to be some financial calamity in a participant. What we heard in the last 24 hours is a lot of this move may have been attributed to an enormous levered bet on U.S. Treasuries by a Japanese hedge fund. It will take 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 weeks for us to really know. Separately, what we do know, though, where the structural complexity of the market, and this is where, Larry, I agree with you, is acute and important to observe, is in the credit markets for private companies. And that is where you have to pay a lot of attention.
我不认同单纯的去看股市的变化来判断经济的变化哈，经济基本上如果它是在一个稳健成长的状况当中的时候，没有错哈，股市当然也会跟着成长。但是过去美国的股市大量的是靠美联储的量化宽松、印钞票的热钱所拱出来的，而且事实上许多的企业因为用这种长期低利息就可以借钱的方式，它钱多到没地方花，大的科技股公司都纷纷在实行库藏股。什么情况？就是说我钱没地方花，直接到市场上，我自己再把我自己的股票给买回来。好，造成股市不断攀高了。事实上，很有可能会出现在经济循环的末期，也就是说，经济事实上已经开始出现生产力越来越少嘛。可是靠着热钱还在不断的维持经济流通的一个假象，它很容易反映出来的。特别是在股市的末升段，这就是为什么我们常会看到说，股市一旦真正开始加速大崩跌、崩坏的时候，快到你根本从前面，哪怕只是上个月，你都完全看不出来，上个月股市还在那最高点。 好，然后接下来就开始大崩。那难道说经济真的是在1个月之内变化的吗？这就是我要给观众朋友的一个提醒，就是股市并不真的去反映当下经济的实体。所以呢，我认为 Summers 讲的是合理的哈。你不能够单纯的去用债市或用股市，下跌了就代表经济搞差了，上涨了就代表经济是好的，这是非常浅薄的一种讲法。这就是股神科斯托兰尼讲的哈，就是股市跟经济的关系就像是主人牵狗散步，狗可能跑得快的时候呢，股市会过热，但是狗它终究被经济的主人的这个绳子绑住，所以呢，它是需要均值回归的时候，狗自然会跑回来。好，然后呢，跑回来之后，狗也可能会跑过度，像是过度恐慌。但是经济如果一直在往前的话，那狗还是会又再回来到主人的身边，也就是回归到一个正常合理的经济。所以经济才是来预测未来的股市，因为股市是狗，经济是主人。不是狗来牵着主人决定主人往哪里走，所以我对于 Larry 的这一种说法，用股市的反应去预测未来经济的变化，这个是非常严重错误。市场永远都会过度恐慌或是过度乐观，你怎么能够用市场去预测未来经济？那难不成如果在短时间之内市场涨了1万点，你要告诉我说经济要大喷发吗？这完全说不通啊！所以回归到一个重点，应该是经济现在的状况在哪里？那这一点呢 ，Summers 他的角度是他认为这样是一种均值回归，我同意有均值回归，不过我更多的比较倾向认为是现在的实体经济其实早就已经在衰退过程中了，只是过去的量化宽松掩盖了这个实体经济衰退长期的事实。而我认为现在川普要救美国的体质，他必须要被迫让这个病症一次的曝光，未来的股市，我个人的看法是还有的跌，好，因为股市目前并不足以反映真实的经济的位阶，当然这是我的看法，给大家做参考。
Okay, Larry, let you respond to Chamath's response to you, and then Ezra, I promise you're going to come in next. Larry, go ahead.
Martha, as you well know, the vast majority of financial thinking emphasizes changes in the earnings prospects of companies associated with the strength of the economy as a major source of stock market fluctuations. And if you look at dividend strips, if you look at what's happening to analyst revisions, that's got a lot to do. Negative prospects for the economy has a lot to do with why the economy, why the stock market has turned downwards. The foreign exchange market's very big, and it's a big referendum on whether people have confidence in the United States. And somehow tariffs reduce imports, are supposed to reduce dollar selling and make the currency go up. And not only is the currency not going up, it's going down substantially. So we're seeing a pattern. Maybe it's all just due to one Japanese hedge fund, but maybe we're seeing a pattern
3 days
that really looks pretty much like the Argentine pattern.
Ezra, you are hearing this debate. I think there's no debate that this was done in a very extreme fashion at a minimum. Do you wonder if this could have been done in a more gradual or thoughtful way? What's your take on the execution here by the administration of these tariffs and their response to the markets?
I can't say I wonder if it could have been done in a more gradual and thoughtful way. It could have. I defer to Larry on the markets. I'm more of a connoisseur of arguments, and something I've been thinking about over the past very long 8 days is covering the 2024 election and covering Donald Trump's tariff promises. And it was a thing that liberals like me were doing, where we would do these shows and say, Donald Trump is promising a 10% to 20% global tariff and then 65% tariff on China. And if he does that, it'll have this set of effects, higher prices, it'll create financial uncertainty, etc. And what I would be told, like the counter argument, was, oh, you libs, you always take him literally when you should be taking him seriously. I had Vivek Ramaswamy on my show. He said he's not going to do that. That's just a negotiating ploy. And this was the common line from Trump allies on Wall Street. And then I watched as he began doing not just that, but layering a series of them bilateral tariffs on top of that plan. The markets began freaking out. While they were freaking out, a bunch of his defenders said, no, actually, these tariffs, which we told you were never going to happen, are actually a great idea. We need to reset the entire global financial system, and you can't shift those tectonic plates without creating a few earthquakes. Then the moment the tariffs paused, or the 90-day pause on the tariffs on top of the 10% and the China tariff, then I heard, nope, that pause is genius. Haven't you read The Art of the Deal? And what I would observe from this is it usually when an idea is good, you don't need people jumping back and forth on it so often, going between these tariffs are a bad idea, but they're a smart negotiating ploy, to these tariffs plus are an actually great idea, and you should all calm down. As Trump said, you should all be cool. Back to no, these tariffs are a great idea. I think something I'd love to hear from David. It's very hard to break the pattern of being a podcast host. I would like to hear what the measure of success in 2 years is. Right, we can sit here and speculate about the effect of these, and I'm much more on Larry's side than what I'm hearing from Chamath and David. But what are your measures? What in 2 years?
Good question.
If manufacturing, employment or whatever is below X, will you be unhappy? If GDP is what is a sort of objective yardstick where we could come back in 700 days and say, did this work out or was this a bad idea?
Good, thanks.
I would say probably the biggest thing would be whether the U.S. can reindustrialize to some extent so that we're not completely dependent for our supply chains on a potentially hostile adversary.
And what is the measure of that? Is it the quantity of manufacturing we're making? Is it the share of manufacturing?
I don't think that's a hard thing to understand. You know, during COVID,
I'm just asking you to set it very tightly.
Point. I am saying it concisely. During COVID, we discovered that we were horribly dependent on a supply chain from China for some of our most essential products, for pharmaceuticals, for other medical gear that we needed during COVID.
Sure. So what would be, if you were to put a metric on it?
Just as one example, but we've also learned that our entire supply chain for all sorts of industrial products now is dependent on China and other countries.
So let's be more precise. We have 4% unemployment at the record low of our lifetimes. And do you think Americans want to work in these factories? And if so, which factories? Obviously, pharmaceuticals, that's a dependency. Obviously, building ships and weapons, that's a dependency. I think we can all agree on that. And that might be low hundreds of thousands of jobs. Do you believe we should be making Nike sneakers here? Do you believe we should be making jeans here again? What would be the objective measure of success? Like a certain number of jobs, certain number of factories, certain types of factories? Because the other piece that I don't understand, and maybe you can inform me here, Sachs, is number one, who's going to do this work if we're going to be deporting millions of people, and we have the lowest unemployment of our lifetimes, and we have automation coming to these factories, and Americans don't want to take these jobs historically? How is this all going to work? It seems a bit farcical to me that we're going to bring these things back.
I don't think the millions of Americans who lost their jobs in the heartland because we let China into the WTO, which is something that Larry, I think, supported and championed.
We're talking about decades ago, though, right?
Yeah. That's what started this whole thing.
这边 Ezra 呢，自由派的独立媒体人呢，他问的这个问题就是说，我们到底应该要怎么去评估川普想要推动回来的制造业，到底要怎么样才叫做好？因为以全球化经济体的一个分工时代来讲，你最不需要的就是什么都自己做。在某些方面，别人的技术或者说别人的制造能力，或者说别人的原物料的取得，它都相对来的比你更有优势的时候，其实让别人来做会减轻整个产品的成本。也就是主持人问到一个很好的问题，就是特别是这个新冠疫情的时候，其实美国人严重的意识到，他们在药品依赖中国大陆的进口是非常非常大的，等于说自己完全都没有制药生产的能力了。这些东西都跟一个国家安全密不可分，所以在科技业、在 AI、在制药上面来讲的话，我们确实该拿回来自己做。但是你说像做一双运动鞋，难道我还要真的也自己跑下去做这个 Nike 运动鞋吗？像这种比较不是什么科技活的东西，是不是让比较低廉的劳工的国家来生产就好了？我觉得这个确实是川普政府他必须要去面对。但是呢，现在川普真的有细化到每一个项目去分出说，这个我可能不想要回来制造，那这个我想要回来制造，我把每一个项目都很严谨的去评估看待之后来个别课税嘛？那坦白说也没有，对吧？原因很简单，第一个就是没有那样的时间可以去评估。我们之前讲的川普经济学的第一底层逻辑，也就是美国的螺旋债务危机的话，其实是没有时间逐项慢慢去评估的。你真的评估，甚至要到发动关税的时候，其实坦白说，任何时间都不够了。我认为川普他现在能做的就是，我先让 所有的东西都加以课税之后，我在一个一个透过跟各国谈判的时候，再来去评估什么其实是我美国实际上可以不需要课的，因为可能这个部分的制造业根本并没有考虑是优先。好，其实不难发现嘛，好比说为什么川普要求美国苹果公司库克承诺要5000亿在美国设厂，他就是要把 iPhone 拿回来做美国制造。好比说为什么要逼台湾台积电过去晶片自行制造生产，因为美国人晶片的依赖度大，可是晶片的可代替性很低。好，你不像穿鞋子，我今天穿不穿 Nike， 对我美国人国防安全、军事产业来讲，其实影响不到哪里去。可是晶片就又完全不一样。所以这个呢，虽然说是一个好问题，但是我比较同意 David 讲，就是美国政府他们自己会有他们的优先顺序，最重要是抓到大原则跟大方向。好 ，Ezra 的问题比较是属于一个细腻的细节，就是我们要不要去评估说，怎么样的才叫做关税贸易战在带动美国制造业有意义？那就像我之前也说了，美国的制造业是不可能短期，更不可能是全部都恢复成美国自给自足。关键的部分其实仍然在于就是美国如何减少对中国大陆的贸易逆差。
Yeah, okay.
Okay, I don't think those millions of people want to lose their jobs. So
You're talking nonsense.
what are you talking about, Larry?
Respectfully, David.
You were Treasury Secretary
Could you name
we walked China into the WTO, and you were just still defending it. I was just watching an interview. Hold on, Larry. Larry, you just did an interview with Neil Ferguson.
May I ask my question?
Why am I the only one who gets to talk for 2 seconds before I get interrupted?
Okay,
you guys get 5 to 10 minutes
finish
speeches.
Your thoughts. Finish your thoughts
Is that
for
the
2
way
or 3
this
minutes,
works?
and then
I get
Larry
to speak
will
for
go.
2 seconds. Then
Go
you
ahead,
interrupt me.
Sachs.
You speak for 5 or 10 minutes.
Go right ahead.
Larry, I just saw you do an interview with Neil Ferguson where he asked you, was it a good idea to bring China into the WTO? Was it a good idea to give them permanent normal trade relations status, basically MFN, which is something that Bill Clinton did in 2000. And I admit it was bipartisan. George W. Bush continued it. And you were defending this as a good idea for the country. What was the result of that over the past 25 years? Millions of industrial jobs were lost. They were exported to China. Millions of factories shut down. The United States has a diminished and hollowed out industrial base. We certainly can't make the products of the future like drones or semiconductors. Jason, just to answer your question, yeah, obviously some industries are more strategic than others. Do I personally care about sneakers or textiles? No, I personally don't. Do I care about semiconductors? Absolutely. Do I care about circuit boards? Do I care about drones? Do I care about robots? Do I care about EVs and cars? Absolutely.
Okay.
Those David, industries, we are no longer in a position. David? We are no longer in a position as a country to make those products because we exported our entire supply chain and manufacturing base to China.
David, I have 3
so how
questions.
is that a good idea, Larry?
Okay,
David,
Larry,
I have
you
3
go,
questions
and then
for you.
Ezra, I'll go back to you and Shimon.
我先跟大家解释哈，最早中国大陆的崛起主要是2000年的时候加入了世界贸易组织，美国啊特别为了想要支持中共，所以呢给了他们 PNTR 呢就叫做永久正常贸易关系，它的前身呢，就是所谓的最惠国待遇，对中国商品的关税就大幅的降低，为了要促进双边的贸易的增长啊。PNTR 简单讲就是可以让中国商品呢能够以较低的关税进入到美国市场，而且呢还减少了所谓进口配额与贸易的限制，也就是说我不限制你进来的量多少。换句话说，美国确实因为自己给予了中国 PNTR 的地位呢，等于相对没有去保护它本国的制造业，这点我认为是毋庸置疑。但是这一点我也必须说，这也是美国制造的，因为美国人当时那个时候想法很简单啊，他们那时候是看准中国大陆未来，特别2战之后，其实大家都想要寻求的是更多的合作，以及全球化贸易。那美国其实在2战之前，美国的制造业是很强劲，美国某种程度上它其实是想要打入中国大陆的市场，所以呢，他用这样的一个方式呢。也是看准说，是不是我也可以输入到你中国大陆14亿人口这么大的一个未来的潜在的消费市场？那么我美国的商品相对而言也可以卖得更好哈。但是20几年来其实并没有发生，因为呢，随着 PNTR 的关系呢，反而是中国大陆呢倾销到美国的这个部分是远远多过中国大陆向美国的进口。中国大陆在过去，它对于美国相对的关税壁垒来讲的话，那仍然是远高过于美国对中国的，反而它做到了自己对内的一定程度的保护。好，更不要说就是我们都知道，光是外资公司要在中国大陆成立公司的话，你都必须要有所谓大陆本地人的这个50%部分。 但是我不同意刚刚 David 讲的一点说，我不在乎运动鞋或纺织业是不是要由我们制造，可是我在乎的是像半导体啊、晶片等等等。可是这个都是后话，你不能事后再来看才认为说这些东西当初就应该做到。恰恰就是最早的时候，美国人他们自己并不在乎这些东西。其实台湾的半导体晶片之所以会发展的如此好，就是因为当年美国人他们本来就是想要把半导体晶片这个部分给代工出去，他们根本就不在乎。那个时候对他们而言，没有想到说未来全球的科技发展会这么样大量的依赖半导体晶片，大家了解我意思吗？所以呢，我认为当别人努力到一个阶段，进而影响或者说改变了全球的科技的比重的时候，你再回来说，我只能说，那这个是你自己决定的哈。那你现在所认为的这个看不上的东西，会不会以后又变得看得上呢？很难说，对吧？所以这个是美国人当初自己的选择，而且我不得不说，美国人当初在中美贸易这件事情上面来讲的话，想法确实是高度的乐观。他那个时候有一种世界大同的想法，就是只要中国大陆的经济起来了，他们的人均收入增加了，那么我们美国的人均收入也会跟着增加，也会更好。为什么？因为他们的人均收入高的话，我们输出给他们的东西，他们也消费得起了。那个时候美国人真的是想得很单纯。
Go
I
ahead,
have
Len.
3 questions for you. 1, can you name a single trade barrier that was reduced by the United States associated with China accession? A single restriction that existed in the United States that had not been in place for 5 years before that we removed during China's WTO accession. Can you name one?
I don't think we should have done any of it, Larry. We threw open our markets to Chinese goods.
What restriction? Your thesis is that we threw open the market and therefore we exposed ourselves to all of this China thing. And question I'm asking you is, can you name any restriction on Chinese exports to the United States that was in effect in 1999 and was removed by our WTO accession in 2000? Can you name any such restriction? Just name
Larry,
one
this
for
was
me.
a policy that built up over time and was basically made permanent. Hold on. It was made permanent when we walked China to the WTO and gave them MFN status.
I'm sorry, David. I'll ask the question one more time. We had given them MFN status 15 years before. No one, they had MFN status. They had it for 15 years. There was not a single reduction in a barrier to Chinese trade. So the way in which you're describing it is just bears no resemblance to what it was.
Why was it necessary to bring them into the WTO? What was the point of bringing them into the WTO?
The point of bringing them into the WTO was to use the leverage that we had to win a whole variety of concessions that enabled us to
Larry, let's be
export
honest.
more to
You guys-
China.
This
You
is
know,
an
it's an interesting
extraordinary
idea.
rewriting
It's
of
called
history, Larry.
reciprocity.
This is an extraordinary
Let's
rewriting
move
of
beyond the
history.
history here.
Larry,
and let's move forward.
I want to
You're
respond to
denying
this.
history. You're denying
totally
history.
denying history. All right, listen.
This is a bad deal.
Hold on a second. Let's go back to this.
Just a minute. I just want to know that the whole argument you are making is about increased exports to the United States that had bad consequences. And so I'm just going to keep asking you, what barrier that previously existed?
Okay, I'll name them. I'll name them. I'll name them.
Go ahead, Chamath. Yeah, let me get
Number
you in on
one.
this.
Prior to the WTO, China imposed a bunch of export duties and taxes on a whole bunch of goods to control outflow. Okay, that prioritized domestic supply. As part of coming into the WTO, China said, hey, hold on, we'll limit these export duties to only a specific set of products. And then they capped those duties at agreed rates. Number two, they eliminated export quotas. They historically had export quotas to manage the volume of goods. Under that WTO commitment, they agreed to phase out all those quantitative restrictions on exports, except where explicitly justified under WTO. Number three, they removed the export licensing restrictions. Number four, they ended state trading monopolies for exports. Number five, they liberalized foreign trade rights. The point is, people thought that China was going to be a honeypot of economic activity, and it turned out to be a sucking sound, a grand sucking sound of opportunity where the globalist corporations saw a massive labor arbitrage. So it's fair to say that it was done with the best of intentions, but it was a bad deal. And they got one over on us.
I really want to say that rather than having 30 minutes of debate over something that happened in the 90s. I would like to go back to this question. I keep not hearing.
I will answer your question, Ezra, because that was a great question.
I would like to hear from David. But I'd love yours too.
Yeah, I never got a chance to.
I think that there's a tendency to just begin talking in an anecdotal way
this
about
is not
industry.
anecdotal.
So,
look,
we want to move forward.
Presidents announce these policies, and then there's never
metrics.
Hold on a second.
Give me what indices you are going to look for, where if in 2 years it is under X, I can come back and we can have a conversation.
Here's some metrics.
Ezra, I'm so sorry.
Here's some metrics for you, okay? Let's go back to Bill Clinton's speech that was given at Johns Hopkins on March 9th, 2000.
No, he was asking about forward-looking metrics. What would you think would be successful 2 years from now? Not the history lesson.
Wait, hold on. We haven't finished the debate about China and PNTR, okay?
But my question predated that debate.
Yeah, we're trying to
Listen, you're trying to change the subject. Let's just finish up on this topic.
No, we're trying to move forward. That's all.
No, we're trying to finish up on this topic, okay?
Okay,
Obviously,
we'll let you
Larry's
get the last word. Go ahead.
About this.
Okay. You can have the last word.
So, March 9th, 2000, Bill Clinton announces PNTR at Johns Hopkins. It's a very famous speech. Larry, maybe you can tell us about how it got written. Anyway, Bill Clinton promises several things. He makes a number of arguments for PNTR. He does not think that this does nothing. Larry, your argument is that Bill Clinton didn't do anything. You're saying that somehow it happened under Reagan or something like that? That's not what Bill Clinton was arguing. He said, number one, there'd be huge economic benefits for the U.S. He says, quote, by this agreement, we will increase exports of American products. He means to China. That will create American jobs. Okay, did that happen the way we intended? I don't think so. Number two is he believed that.
Have you looked at the data on export flows from the United States to China? It actually did happen at a quite substantial rate.
But with huge trade deficits for the United States. You're arguing that they did not act in a discriminatory way towards our products? This idea that Americans could just do business in China the way that they could do business here is ridiculous. Anyone who tried to do business over there knows you have to create a JV, you have to get a local partner, give them 51%. It was extraordinarily difficult. We were discriminated against, Larry. It's ridiculous to try and claim that somehow this was an equal relationship, okay? And we imported far more from them than we ever exported to them. So Bill Clinton was wrong about that. Number two, he said that signing PNTR and bringing China to the WTO would promote democracy in China, that we would export one of democracy's most cherished values, economic freedom. Did that happen? I don't think so. He said this would strengthen global trade by ensuring China adhere to international trade rules, reducing trade barriers, and resolving disputes through WTO. Did that happen? I don't think so. And then he said on national security, he said it would improve our national security to bring China to WTO and help make them rich. He said, quote, if we don't deal with China in this way, we will increase the prospect that they will turn inward. That's not what happened. We helped make China rich. We've exported millions of jobs to them. They built up their economy and their supply chain to the point where now they are a global competitor to the United States. They're a pure competitor. We turned that baby dragon into a Drogon-sized monster that can now challenge us in Asia and across the world for primacy. Why in the world we have done that? Just for national security reasons. Okay. That was a very foolish thing to do.
Okay. So, Larry, I guess I have to let you maybe self-grade. How did you guys do? Is there any regrets, as Sachs is pointing out there? Obviously, China has not magically become a democracy, but I guess you could argue they do have a middle class now. We haven't gone to war with them, so I guess you could argue that this has been good for relations. But to Sachs's point, they are incredibly powerful and they are our top adversary. How would you grade the history of this so we can move forward?
China was a surging, growing, reforming economy, growing at double-digit rates. That it was before there was any WTO agreement. The WTO agreement did not change a single rule that represented a U.S. restriction on imports from China. It did change a variety of rules, not as far as I would have liked, that let the United States export more to China and that protected United States intellectual property in China and that brought China more closely into the international system. You need a counterfactual for what would have happened if China had been excluded from the World Trade Organization. That counterfactual is not that they would not have sold goods to the United States. That principle had already been crossed 15 years before. Not a single restriction was reduced.
其实呢 ，Larry 就是一直在重复的强调，2000年克林顿时期给予中国的 PNTR 待遇呢，是在更早之前的1980年，是美国总统卡特的时候呢，就已经给了中国最惠国待遇了，也就是我们刚刚听到的 MFN， 最惠国待遇。那他的意思就是说，卡特给的最惠国待遇，一直到2000年给的 PNTR 呢，我们并没有自我去减少任何一个关税啊，我们没有减少任何关税减免，一直都是如此啊。那为什么要把这个锅呢怪到我在当克林顿总统时的这个财务部长任期内呢？我觉得 Larry 这样讲，其实某种程度上他就是承认了，过去这几十年来，中国利用了一个好处的特殊身份的时候，他不断的去出口倾销，而成为了 Made in China 中国制造，成为了一个最赚钱的国家。只不过在于是说，到底谁该背这个锅而已。那实际上我来补充一个正确的资讯给大家。克林顿总统在1993年，美国对中国的贸易逆差是100亿美元。那一直到2001年，克林顿要卸任的时候呢，贸易逆差急剧增加到了830亿美元。好，所以你可以发现，在克林顿这8年期间呢，美国从中国进口的商品数量急剧增加，而他们自己的出口成长则相对大幅缓慢。2000年中国才加入了世界贸易组织。那克林顿卸任的时候是不是2001年？所以换句话说，从1993年到2001年的时候，这个贸易逆差就已经在前面头7年的时候快速的被拉开了。那美国跟中国其实这个贸易逆差过去一直不被美国人视作是一个危机。相反的，美国呢跟中国的关系最高的甜蜜点是在2007年。因为2008年的时候是金融海啸嘛，美国事实上在2007年的时候都还认为中美这样合作无间的关系呢，非常的好。
赴汤蹈火，上刀山下油锅，好兄弟，真是好兄弟啊！罩着我大哥，靠你了大哥，喝交杯。来。
而且呢，在2007年的时候，美国自己的举债规模就已经来到了9兆美元，也就是9万亿。那到了2008年金融海啸之后呢，因为那个时候美国政府为了要救市，要刺激经济，怕出现过去大萧条时代，怕通货紧缩，所以呢，就用美联储在量化宽松、印钞票的方式，大规模的举债。短短的这1年，举债规模呢就来到了10.6兆美元，也就是又多增加了1.6兆美元，并且养大了之后，所有一旦面临有一点动荡的时候呢，美国就是一直习惯性的用这种量化宽松的方式。后来看到到 COVID-19 的时候，2019年开始到2020年又到了一个全新的高峰，总共美国的举债规模时至今日已经来到了36兆美元这么多了。所以这就是美国现在面临到的困境。那你说美国人自己这种举债的习惯，为了要去刺激经济，也是因为过去他长期依赖他全球美元霸权这样的一个地位。那现在美国人呢才发现，过去呢几十年贸易逆差，我们非但没赚钱，可以说是借钱买人家的东西。日本跟中国大陆都是美国最大的国债的持有国，日本是第1，中国大陆是第2。这样子的模式，美国人现在才恍然惊觉我们等于是在跟人家借钱买人家的东西。那这样子长期玩下去的话，迟早身家要败光光。当然。另外一个问题，我觉得是比较值得再去思考，就是说，美国现在把中国大陆视为家乡地，还有一个很大原因，是因为中国大陆相较于日本，它本身是共产主义国家，它的经济从来都没有真正实现到美国人力举中国大陆进入世界贸易组织想要达到的目标，就是自由贸易。那么现在美国人一来又担心的是中国大陆的政体，而又因为过去长期最大的贸易逆差是对中国大陆，所以这2个因素之下，以至于美国把中国大陆视为是最大的敌人。那当然我们也可以换另外一个角度的问题，就是倘若如果今天中国大陆它假设是民主国家，如果真的都实现的是自由贸易，那么今天美国就真的不把中国大陆视作是敌人吗？这是不是另外一个有趣的问题？那我就留给大家去想。不过我个人还是要再重申，就是说，很多人呢之前看过我做的川普经济学的3部曲，特别是中国大陆的网友呢，我就发现很容易呢会觉得好像我在谈的东西很伤到中国大陆人的一些自身的感情。 其实大家如果看我谈的3部曲，跟看我今天给大家介绍这部片子，其实大家就会发现到，我并没有在这件事情上面带着一个谁对谁错的立场，我只是告诉大家，川普为什么会这样想，以及川普他现在为了要救美国病入膏肓的情况，他为什么不得不去采取这些手段。但是就像我今天在这部影片谈到的，我也强调的就是过去美国人自己的一厢情愿，他以为只要中国富强了、富裕了，那美国人只会更有钱，也会跟着富裕。就他没想到，经济永远比的是真实的生产力，而不是华尔街的那一套金融商品游戏的规则。美国现在就发现他的体质很虚嘛。所以我在谈的是川普的逻辑，不论你爱听或不爱听，你都应该客观的去看待川普是怎么想的。美国现在最大的麻烦就是他要如何摆脱掉每年高达1兆美元以上的利息支出，更不要讲光是到今年，他连国债到期总共要还的规模是9兆美元，好加利息，他现在只能够靠关税贸易战想办法在最短时间之内去减少跟各国的多项赤字。所以从我的角度来看，美国未来要经历的黑暗期相当的大。但是呢，你说中国大陆就一定好过吗？以后会留着一期呢专门来谈我对未来中美两国之间的一个看法以及预测。但今天这一期大家会发现，上半场整个辩论的焦点围绕在就是美国人是否当年就不应该让中国大陆加入 WHO。 好，那你又是怎么看的呢？你真的认为当年的美国人做错了吗？还是说你认为当年并没有做错，而是中间有太多时候是美国人自己的养尊处优，以至于轻忽了长期严重贸易逆差的事实？那另外一个关键问题就是，美国是不是应该重新重置？都欢迎给我你宝贵的意见，在下方留言哦。我们这边是超级神队友，我们就下部影片再见，拜拜。
Cornerstone is Christ alone.